I woke up to the smell of smoke, thick, acrid, and wrong. My first thought was the fields. Had lightning struck in the night? A dry patch gone up in flames? But no, this was closer. Too close. I shoved open the bedroom window and my stomach dropped. My combine harvester was on fire. The flames licked up the metal frame, black smoke twisting into the morning sky. My heart slammed against my ribs as I tore down the stairs and out the front door, the searing heat pushing against me as I skidded to a stop a few feet away. It was too late. The harvester, the lifeline of my farm, was gutted, an inferno reducing it to nothing but twisted steel and charred rubber. A flicker of movement near the road caught my eye. A dark SUV, headlights off, turning the corner at the far end of the property. I didn't need to see the license plate to know exactly who it was. The HOA, more specifically, Mrs. Pennington, the self-appointed tyrant of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. My hands curled into fists as I stared at the wreckage. I'd told her no. No, I wouldn't sign her ridiculous contract. No, my farm, passed down through generations, wasn't part of her picture-perfect suburban nightmare. And no, I didn't care that my tractor was unsightly, or that my farmhouse wasn't painted in a pre-approved shade of beige. She hadn't taken kindly to that. The threats started small, passive-aggressive notes stuffed in my mailbox, petty complaints about imaginary infractions. A week ago, I found a letter taped to my door, printed on official HOA letterhead. Failure to comply with Oak Ridge HOA community standards will result in escalating penalties. I wasn't even in their jurisdiction, but that didn't stop them. Then came the fines. $500 for excessive noise when I ran my irrigation system at dawn. Another $750 for unpermitted livestock because my 2 barn cats weren't registered household pets. I ignored them. They had no legal ground. But Pennington wasn't after money. She was after control. And now she'd made it clear. If I wouldn't obey, I wouldn't farm. A gust of wind carried embers toward my truck, and I snapped out of my shock. The fire was spreading. I sprinted to the hose, yanked it from the reel, and sprayed the flames, but it was useless. The harvester was beyond saving. By the time the fire department arrived, there was nothing left but a smoldering husk. Sheriff Douglas, a tired-looking man with a gut full of coffee and a face full of regret, scratched the back of his neck as he looked at the wreckage. "Damn shame," he muttered. I exhaled sharply. "Arson." He didn't argue. He just let out a long sigh. "Got any proof?" I clenched my jaw. I'd seen them. I knew it was the HOA. But I had nothing solid. No video, no eyewitness. Just a burned-out machine and a gut feeling. "Let me guess," I said. "Nothing you can do?" Douglas hesitated, then gave me that same placating look I'd seen too many times before. "No evidence means no arrest. I'll open a report, but unless something turns up..." I turned my back on him before he could finish. Mrs. Pennington thought she was untouchable, that she could set fire to my livelihood and get away with it, that I'd fold. She was wrong. That evening, as I sat on my porch, staring at the blackened skeleton of my harvester, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight her with lawyers. I wasn't going to waste time arguing with a sheriff whose hands were tied. I was going to hit them where it hurt. The HOA thrived on its pristine image, manicured lawns, perfect houses, and a grocery store stocked with fresh local produce. My produce. And as of this moment, they weren't getting a single damn carrot from me. The first sign of trouble came 2 days later. At sunrise, I drove into town, pulled up behind Miller's Market, and let the store manager, Greg, know exactly what was happening. He was a good man, but he had a business to run, and without my shipments, he wouldn't have anything local to sell. By the afternoon, the shelves were already thinning. By the next morning, panic had set in. I stopped by the store just to watch. People paced the aisles, scowling at empty produce bins. A woman clutched a grocery list, shaking her head as she stared at the out-of-stock sign in the dairy section. Then came the whispers. "Did you hear? The farmer. He cut off supplies. They said it's because of the HOA. Mrs. Pennington's behind this, isn't she?" That afternoon, I spotted Pennington outside the HOA office. Lips pursed, so tight they practically vanished. She wasn't worried yet, but she would be. That night, I sat in my truck outside the market, watching the lights flicker off one by one. The air was thick with tension, a storm brewing, and just as I was about to leave, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. A woman stood on the sidewalk, looking around nervously before walking toward my truck. I recognized her immediately. Emily Carter. She lived 2 streets over. Always kept. Her head down, never spoke up during HOA meetings. She hesitated for just a moment before knocking on my window. I rolled it down and she shoved her phone toward me. "I need to show you something," she whispered. I took the phone, and as the video started playing, my stomach turned to ice. It was grainy, shot from a distance, but clear enough. The dark SUV, the flicker of flames, and then, unmistakably, Mrs. Pennington. She was standing there, watching the fire spread. I looked up at Emily. Her hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. But now, she swallowed hard. Now, everyone's suffering. I gripped the phone tighter, heart hammering. This was it, the proof I needed. Mrs. Pennington thought she'd won, but she didn't know what was coming next. I stared at Emily's phone, the flickering flames illuminating the dark SUV and the grainy footage. And there, clear as day, stood her, arms crossed, watching, no panic, no hesitation, just cold, deliberate satisfaction. I exhaled, steadying the fire inside me. "You realize what this means?" Emily nodded, her hands still shaking. "I know. You were scared to come forward before," I said carefully. "What changed?" She swallowed, eyes darting around like she expected Pennington's goons to emerge from the shadows. "The food shortages. People are panicking. My kids..." Her voice hitched. "I can't let this go on. I can't let her get away with it." I studied her for a moment. She looked exhausted, worn down, but determined. I nodded. "All right, we do this smart. I didn't rush to the police. I didn't storm the HOA office and throw the evidence in Pennington's smug face. No, this was a woman who had spent years twisting rules to her advantage, stacking the deck so high that no one dared challenge her. If I wanted to bring her down, I had to be careful. I had to make her crack first. Emily hesitated as I handed her phone back. "You're not using it?" "Not yet," I said. "First, we let the pressure build." The next morning, I drove into town early. People were already gathering in front of Miller's Market, their frustration mounting. I saw Greg standing at the entrance, arms crossed, jaw clenched. When he spotted me, he strode over. "You did this," he said, voice low. "I did," I admitted. He scowled, but he wasn't angry, just worried. I get why, but people are going to start pointing fingers, and you know damn well Pennington's already spinning this against you. "She can spin it however she wants," I said evenly. "Won't change the fact that I control the food." Greg sighed. "How long you planning to keep this up?" I looked at the restless crowd forming behind him. "Until it hurts her." By noon, it was working. The HOA's grip depended on keeping people complacent, comfortable, the perfect illusion of suburban bliss. But now, that illusion was shattering. By mid-afternoon, Pennington was forced to show her face. I spotted her marching toward the grocery store, her tailored blouse stiff with barely contained rage. 2 of her board members trailed behind her, their nervous, glances confirming what I already knew. She was losing control. I stayed in my truck watching as she stormed up to Greg, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at the empty produce bins. "This is unacceptable," she snapped. "Your job is to maintain adequate stock for our community. And yet, this," she gestured around her, "is what I find?" Greg held his ground. "My job," he said slowly, "is to sell what I get. And since your little war with the farmer cut off our supply, this is what happens." Pennington's expression twisted. She turned sharply, eyes scanning the lot, until she found me. I gave her a small nod. Her lips curled into something that was supposed to be a smirk, but there was a crack in her composure. She stalked toward my truck, stopping just short of my driver's side window. "You're making a mistake," she said, voice like polished steel. I let my fingers drum against the steering wheel. "Am I?" Her nostrils flared. People won't blame me. They'll blame you. The stubborn little farmer starving the community because he can't handle a few rules. I laughed, slow and deliberate. I think you're underestimating how much people hate being told what to do. I leaned in slightly. But more than that, they hate being controlled. And you've been playing dictator for too long. For the first time I saw it, the faintest flicker of doubt in her eyes. Good. She turned on her heel, retreating to the sidewalk where the other HOA members whispered nervously. Then, she did what all petty tyrants do when their power is threatened. She doubled down. That evening, new notices appeared on doors across town. Mandatory community compliance meeting. Attendance required. The fine print made it clear any household that failed to attend would be subjected to further review. Thinly veiled threats. She was trying to reassert control. I grinned. Let's see how that works out for you, Pennington. The meeting was held at the HOA's office, a glass-fronted building they'd built with community funds. Without community. Approval. I arrived early, blending into the murmuring crowd. People looked nervous. A few shot me wary glances as if I was the problem. That was the power of people like Pennington. They kept everyone too afraid to push back. She entered the room with the confidence of a queen addressing her subjects. I understand there's been some unrest, she began, her tone dripping with condescension. But I want to assure you that everything is under control. Murmurs of uncertainty rippled through the room. As you know, she continued, the recent disruptions in our local food supply have been manufactured by a single individual who refuses to comply with the very standards that keep our community thriving. Her gaze swept the room until it landed on me. I didn't look away. She smiled, too wide. But rest assured, we are working on a solution. Then she dropped the bomb. I've spoken with the county, and as of tomorrow, the Oak Ridge HOA will be filing for eminent domain to reclaim underutilized land for community benefit. Silence. And then confusion. Whispers. Nervous glances. I kept my expression neutral, but my blood ran cold. She was trying to take my farm. Pennington continued, basking in the shock. This will allow us to create a community garden and restore balance to our food supply. Everyone wins. Her eyes flicked to me, daring me to react. I stayed perfectly still. She thought this was checkmate. She thought I'd panic, that I'd lash out, that I'd lose control and play right into her hands. But I wasn't done yet. Stood, slow and deliberate. The room fell silent. Funny thing, I said, my voice calm. You call my land underutilized. I took a step forward. But I call it privately owned. Pennington tilted her head, feigning sympathy. Well, that's a matter for the courts. A cruel smirk curled at the edge of her lips. I let the silence hang just long enough. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and turned the screen toward the crowd. Emily's video, the flames, the SUV, and Pennington. The murmur of the crowd turned to gasps. Pennington's expression flickered just for a second before she laughed. This? She scoffed. This is obviously fabricated. I expected her to deny it. But what she said next sent a slow, cold chill down my spine. And even if it weren't, who do you think they'll believe? The room fell silent. And that's when I realized she wasn't scared. She had another play. I just didn't know what it was. Yet. The room was still caught in that stunned silence, the weight of the accusation heavy in the air. The video, undeniable proof, was still playing on my phone, the flickering flames casting a harsh glow on Mrs. Pennington's face. And yet, there, she stood, arms crossed, smirking. A woman caught red-handed should have been scrambling, backpedaling, maybe even begging, but not her. She wasn't scared. She was confident. Something was wrong. Then she spoke. I have to say, she mused, her voice silk smooth, I'm impressed. You're quite the little storyteller. She gestured toward my phone, completely unfazed. And I'm sure that blurry, out-of-focus mess of a video is very compelling to those who don't understand how easily digital media can be manipulated. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd. She saw it, fed off it, and pressed forward. "I mean, really," she laughed, shaking her head. "Deepfakes, AI-generated images, this is exactly the kind of garbage we've seen used to smear. Good, hard-working people." She turned to the audience, eyebrows raised in mock concern. "Do you really think I, your neighbor, would burn down someone's equipment over a property dispute?" People hesitated. They had seen the video, but doubt was a powerful thing. And Pennington knew it. She owned this town, controlled it for years. She didn't need the truth on her side. She just needed to muddy the waters. I clenched my fists. She wasn't trying to prove her innocence. She was trying to make proof irrelevant. Then she delivered the killing blow. "This man," she said, nodding toward me, "is holding our food hostage. He's starving this community to make himself look like the victim." Gasps, shocked murmurs. Few heads turned toward me, hesitation turning to anger. That's when I realized her play. She was flipping it, turning me into the villain, and it was working. I opened my mouth to speak, but Pennington wasn't finished. And now, he presents. This laughable video? The timing is just too perfect, isn't it? She let out a fake sigh, shaking her head. Honestly, it's sad. The lengths some people will go to in order to cover their own selfishness. I could feel it. The shift. The crowd wasn't sure. Anymore. I had proof, but she had power, and she knew how to wield it. I had to stop this. "You're saying this video is fake?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She smiled. "I'm saying it's not real evidence. And without real evidence," she turned to the crowd, arms wide. "This is nothing but a desperate man trying to save face." People nodded. Pennington had them. I had to think fast. "Then why don't we let the police decide?" I challenged. "Let them analyze it. If it's fake, you have nothing to worry about, right?" Her smile faltered. Just for a second. "Got you." She recovered quickly. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You think the county police have the resources to authenticate some low-quality phone footage?" She pivoted, turning back to the audience. "And even if this was real, let's consider the actual problem here." She lifted her voice, steering the conversation back. "Our families are going hungry because of him." I felt the shift again. Angry whispers. More glares in my direction. Pennington's game was simple. It didn't matter if she burned my harvester down. If she could make the town hate me more than they hated her, she'd win. And right now, she was winning. I gritted my teeth. I needed to turn this around. Fast. Then, a voice cut through the noise. I saw it. Silence. Every head turned. Emily stood near the back, shaking but standing her ground. I saw it happen," she said, louder this time. "I took the video, and I know what I saw." Pennington's eyes went sharp. "Emily, dear," she cooed, "I understand this must be very—" "No," Emily cut her off, stronger this time. "I saw your SUV. I saw you." A shockwave rippled through the room. For the first time, Pennington hesitated. Her gaze flicked to the crowd, gauging the reaction. People were listening now. She needed to shut this down, and fast. Her smile returned, but it was thinner now. "Emily, I know you've been under a lot of stress lately. It's understandable to—" "I have the original file," Emily interrupted. "I never sent it anywhere. If it was fake, we'd know." A murmur of agreement. I took the opening. "If you have nothing to hide, Mrs. Pennington, why don't we hand it over to the authorities? Let them verify it?" Her smile disappeared. She was trapped. If she refused, she looked guilty. If she agreed, she risked real exposure. For the first time, Pennington had no words. Then, a door slammed open. A man in a crisp suit strode in. Dark. Hair, expensive watch. A lawyer, Pennington's lifeline. "Enough of this circus," he announced. "Mrs. Pennington has no further comment." A few people gasped. "No further comment? Just like that?" The lawyer turned to me. "You will receive a formal cease and desist. This baseless harassment ends tonight." He handed me an envelope. I didn't take it. I stared at Pennington. She wasn't smug anymore. She was waiting, and then it hit me. She wasn't just shutting down the meeting. She was stalling. I turned sharply to Emily. "Where's your phone?" Her face paled. She patted her pockets. Then froze. I don't know," she whispered. I checked my phone. The video was gone. Deleted. My heart slammed against my ribs. Pennington had gotten to it. She had wiped the only evidence. Emily's eyes darted around, wildly. "It was here. I swear, it was—" Pennington exhaled dramatically. "Oh, what a shame," she murmured. "It appears there's been some sort of accident." A cold chill ran down my spine. She had planned for this. She was still ahead. I wasn't just losing. I was out of moves, or so she thought. Because what she didn't know, Emily had sent me a backup. Pennington had taken my harvester. But now, I was about to take everything from her. She thought she'd won. That erasing the video had erased the truth. But what she didn't know was that Emily, paranoid as she was, had sent me a backup before she ever stepped foot in that meeting. And I wasn't about to waste it. I kept my expression neutral, tucking my phone back into my pocket as if I was conceding, letting her bask in her false victory. "Looks like this meeting's over," I said flatly, turning on my heel toward the door. Pennington smirked, her confidence restored. "Smartest decision you've made all night." She had no idea what was coming. I went straight to Sheriff Douglas. Emily sat across from his desk, wringing her hands as I pulled out my phone. "This is the unedited original, time-stamped directly from Emily's device," I said. Placing it in front of him, Douglas leaned forward, peering at the screen as the video played. The flames, the SUV, Pennington. Emily barely breathed as he watched. Then he exhaled, rubbing his face. "Well," he muttered, "that's real damning." A beat of silence passed. Then he sat up, his expression hardening. "All right, I'll bring it to the DA." Emily let out a breath she'd been holding. I nodded. "And one more thing." Douglas frowned. "What?" "I want you to hold a press conference." He blinked. "You serious?" "Dead serious," I said. "Pennington's power comes from perception. The second this town sees who she really is, she's done." Douglas hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do." The next morning, it began. At 10 a.m., the county sheriff's office released a public statement. By noon, the video was everywhere, the news stations, the town's social media groups, every doorstep. The reaction was immediate. Neighbors who once feared Pennington suddenly saw her for what she was. People who had followed her out of convenience now saw the monster behind the HOA's rules. And, by 3 p.m., Pennington's house was surrounded. Not by cops, by the very people she had controlled for years, the same ones she had threatened, fined, and manipulated. She tried to shut her blinds and pretend it wasn't happening. But the noise outside grew louder. "Resign, Pennington. HOA's over. We're done being your puppets." She had ruled through fear, but fear only worked when people felt alone. And now, they weren't afraid anymore. By 4 p.m., a petition was drafted to dissolve the HOA entirely. By 6 p.m., it had over 200 signatures. By 8 p.m., the county prosecutor announced an official investigation into Pennington and her board. And at 9 p.m., when she finally emerged onto her front porch, she wasn't the untouchable queen of Oak Ridge anymore. She was a criminal, a fraud, a woman who had just lost everything. She tried to save face, standing tall as Sheriff Douglas and his deputies approached her front steps. But the moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, that's when the cracks finally showed. Her face paled. Her lip trembled. She tried one last time, grasping for control. "I have rights!" she shrieked, twisting in Douglas's grip. "You people have no idea who you're messing with, but—" The crowd laughed, because she had no idea who she had been messing with. All of us. As she was shoved into the back of a squad car, the HOA members she had once controlled stared in silence. None of them moved to help her. None of them even looked in her direction. She had built this house of cards, and now she was buried beneath its collapse. The HOA was dead. Over the next few weeks, the community transformed. The pointless fines? Gone. The constant fear of crossing the wrong person? Gone. The HOA office, once Pennington's throne room of power, was bulldozed. In its place, we built something else. A community park. No rules, no restrictions, no arbitrary punishments, just people. Neighbors who actually talked to each other instead of fearing some bureaucratic tyrant lurking in their mailbox. One evening, I stood at the edge of the park, watching kids play where Pennington's office once stood. Emily walked up beside me, arms crossed. "You did it," she said. I exhaled, shaking my head. "We did it," she smiled. "Guess you won't have to hold the food hostage anymore." I grinned. "Guess not." We stood there for a moment, watching the sunset cast golden streaks across the sky. Then she nudged me. "You know what's funny?" I raised an eyebrow. "What?" She nodded toward the park, a mischievous glint in her eye. "We used her HOA funds to build this." I blinked, then let out a laugh. Poetic justice. After everything, this was Pennington's legacy. Not a dictatorship, not a reign of terror, just a park. A place where people could finally breathe. I watched as a group of kids ran past, kicking up dust where Pennington's rules had once been written. And for the first time in a long time, Oak Ridge felt like home. The kind that no one, not even a tyrant, could take away again.